Good morning. It's afternoon here because my old notes. Good morning, everyone, and welcome to the meeting of the Corporate Governance and Audit Committee. My name is Councillor Paul Ray, and I will be chairing today's meeting. Today's meeting is being live cast onto the council's website so that the public can observe the meeting without needing to be present. I will ask, obviously, because members of the public are watching, if you can try and prevent yourself from using acronyms and abbreviations to make sure it's as open and transparent to the public as possible. I'll now invite members and officers to introduce themselves. So please remember to turn your microphone off once you've been introduced, and we'll go from this side around.
I'm Kate Sadler, Lead Officer to the committee.
I'm Councillor Jane Dowson, Chapel Allerton Ward Councillor.
Good morning, I'm Councillor Morel Mitchell-Leakey, Paxton Methley Ward.
Councillor Gower Almas from the Beeston and Albick Ward.
Tim Rollett from the Council's Intelligence and Policy Service.
Becca Roberts, Legal Officer.
Richard Ellis, Deputy Chief Officer, Financial Services.
Paul Burns from Information Governance.
Mary Hasnip, Head of Finance in Corporate Financial Management.
Good morning, everybody. David Feeney, Chief Planning Officer for Leeds.
Good morning, I'm Louise Booth. I'm the Head of Audit.
Jonathan Foster, Senior Audit Manager.
Angela Laycock, Principal Audit Manager. Louise Ivans, Principal Audit Manager.
Victoria Bradshaw, Chief Finance Officer.
Morning, Chair. Morning, everyone. Gareth Mills, Grant Thornton, External Audit.
Aminda Sessi, Grant Thornton, External Audit.
Good morning, Linda Wild, Independent Member.
Morning, Councillor Rick Downs, Otley and Yeadon Ward.
Good morning, Billy Flynn, Councillor for Adler and Wharfdale Ward.
Good morning, Debbie Oldham, and I'm the Clerk to the committee.
We have that one more person that's quickly turning up, so we'll just let Councillor Lingworth sit down and can introduce himself as well, and then we'll get going. Don't worry, I'm exactly the same this morning, John, it's fine. Introduce yourself, John, quite quickly. So moving on to item agenda number 1.
Thank you, Chair. Under agenda item 1, there are no appeals against the refusal of inspection of documents. Under agenda item 2, there are no late items. Under agenda item 3, there are no formal late items. However, there was supplementary information, which was in relation to agenda item 9, Grant Thornton Annual Report and Value for Money Findings 2020-21, and this has been circulated to members. Could I just check that everybody has got a copy of that?
Yeah.
So under agenda item 4, could I ask members to declare any interests? Thank you. I'll take silence as there are none. Agenda item 5, apologies have been received from Councillors Shemmelt, Harrand and Truswell. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you very much for that. So moving on to item agenda 6 and 7. First of all, are the minutes a correct record of the meeting held on the 29th of July? I'm seeing nods, so I'll take that as a yes. Are there any matters arising from minutes that we're aware of? Mary?
Thank you, Chair. Yes, just a brief update in terms of the 2021 accounts process. So I'm afraid there's been no progress at a national level in agreeing a way forward in terms of the technical accounting issue in terms of roads and other infrastructure assets. So we're still at the position where our 2021 statement of accounts can't be finalised yet. So we're hopeful that we may be in a position to finalise this at the next meeting of the committee in late November. But at this stage, we can't guarantee that, as that's not really within our control. It's dependent on an agreed way forward being put in place at a national level.
Thank you for that, Mary. And I think we all share the frustration of nationally them not getting it sorted out yet, so that we can move on with these things. So thank you for that. Do members have any other further matters to raise? Taking silence is a good indicator. Let's go down my notes. So item agenda number 8. Over to you, David.
Thank you, Chair. I'm conscious that you've got a very busy agenda this morning. Would you like me to take you through some headlines of the report? Chair, I'll just open the report up to questions.
If you want to take it as read, and then we'll open it up straight to questions because it's a busy agenda. So we'll take it as read, colleagues. Are there any questions for David here on the planning enforcement report? Looks like Councillor Illingworth, and then down.
Yeah, I'm sorry I haven't got my breath back properly yet, but there are, particularly in the case of listed buildings, worries in my mind about how effective our enforcement is. This legislation isn't helpful, but in addition, we're understaffed. It's difficult area to legislate and argue in. And looking back, I can see we've lost lots of buildings that we needn't have lost, and thinking that we could do better. So that specific area of planning enforcement worries me a lot. And I don't think we're performing particularly well, but if officers want to respond to that.
Is there a specific audit related question and corporate governance question there that rather than the general point about planning? Because remember, this is the Corporate Governance and Audit Committee, so it's about our processes rather than whether or not we think they've done enough we would like. So is there a specific question in relation to the committee's remit? I mean, if you want to quickly touch on that, David, but I again appreciate this. The remit of this is over the audit and the corporate governance rather than the specifics of the planning department.
Thank you, Chair. I mean, just on the point you've raised, Councillor, I'm very mindful of enforcement issues and staffing levels in particular. We have sought through various iterations of recruitment to bolster our enforcement service. We did get some COVID relief funding, which is enormously helpful to the service in dealing with backlog issues and certainly a very large caseload in terms of enforcement cases. But we did recruit 2 additional posts within enforcement to try and tackle those issues. But I hear what you say, these are difficult issues at times to resolve, but we do have a buildings at risk register as well. So we are mindful of the status and importance of listed buildings and their longer term care and retention. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. Councillor Dowson.
Yeah, I was going to ask Councillor Illingworth's question for him, but the same point goes for lots of other things that planning have to do. And as councillors, we know you've got timescales to hit. Otherwise people can actually just get permission and it just runs over, which means that we're quite vulnerable to poor planning decisions because they're not decisions, they're actually things you have to do. So I suppose from a corporate audit point of view, bearing in mind you now do the pre-apps and there's a lot more work involved, do you think that there's enough money given to planning to actually hit all the functions that you actually have as a department?
That's a good question, Councillor. I would say no. Although we are obviously doing our best with the resources we have available to us, and the measures that we've introduced are to try and streamline the system and to improve matters to get the quality of decision and the outcomes. In terms of the pre-app service, I think that's helpful in sort of front loading planning matters, so we get an early sight of applications coming into the system and the policy issues associated with it, etc., etc. Applicants sometimes don't adhere to the advice we give at a pre-application stage, so there is an issue there, but we do endeavour to put forward the council's policy position. I think in terms of resources going forward, there are some challenges coming down the line as part of the government's planning reforms. These have been sort of announced a number of occasions, but the most recent announcement was back in May. And one of the issues is around sort of the improved digitisation of planning services. And we're very mindful of the need for that infrastructure to be put in place. And we are working closely with our colleagues in IDS to try and improve our back office systems, as well as gearing ourselves up for these future changes. But there are pressures, I think, elsewhere across the council as well in being able to deliver the infrastructure that we need. Thank you.
By way of follow-up, do you think that makes us quite vulnerable as a council, because we're looking at buildings similar to the ones Councillor Illingworth was talking about, and other construction where we've got potentially safety issues. We've got our green agenda, climate neutral by 2030, and all this relies on a planning system that actually is fit for purpose. We actually front load neighbourhood plans. We give money to communities to produce their own neighbourhood plans, and I'm assuming they're still supplementary planning documents. So there's a lot of finance goes into things that could be overshadowed by the fact we're not making those decisions. And I say there are safety issues also in things going through that potentially shouldn't because of that staffing issue. So there was a question in there somewhere for you, but basically, do you think the council leaves itself quite vulnerable if we don't get these decisions made in a timely fashion?
I think in terms of decision making, I think it's a valid point you've made about applicants can go to appeal on the basis of non-determination of applications, and that is a risk to the council in terms of potential costs or reputational damage if we don't meet our performance targets. It's incumbent on the council and on the planning service to meet national performance targets, and I don't want those targets to drop. The challenge we've had in recent years has been the sort of backlog arising through COVID. We've had a very large number of applications through the system. In parallel with that, we've had changes to national planning policy, which are seeking to deregulate parts of the planning system with the intention of trying to streamline things and make things a little bit easier. I think that is challenging because often those national changes aren't communicated in a way where the operational detail is very clear when those announcements are made. So we have found at times ourselves inventing processes to meet national requirements which haven't been clearly set out. So from that point of view, that there is a vulnerability in case there's a misinterpretation or there's a risk of potential challenge. But I think I'm confident that there are enough checks and balances in the system we have in Leeds and the level of scrutiny and the oversight that we are trying to mitigate all of those risks.
I just say, Chair, that's actually quite pertinent. So the government are making headline announcements without enough detail to back them up. Thank you.
And that's why when it was said at the council about the report, getting governance right is important, because otherwise you get yourself into hot bother. Councillor Flynn.
Thanks. I'm sure you'll tell me if this isn't germane to this particular committee, Paul. David, can planning officers, conservation officers make a decision on a planning operation, on a planning application, without actually visiting the site when there's a dispute over what I'd actually say about the application?
It depends what the issue is. I mean, I would have thought if there were particular on-site issues that could only be understood by visiting the site rather than looking at it through Google Maps or whatever it might be, then it would be better for those officers to look at the site and look at those details. So we do allow for that within the approach that we've set out.
The particular application I'm thinking about, I actually asked the officers to meet me on site, and I was told that basically that didn't happen anymore. When I queried, I was told that wasn't the case, but they never came out to sort of meet me on site.
Well, if you want to come back to me outside of this meeting, Councillor, I'm happy to look at that for you and understand what the circumstances are. We are trying to streamline our processes to avoid unnecessary meetings in the round to improve our efficiencies and to meet our income and efficiency targets, but we have never said that we would not meet on site if that was necessary.
I mean, I think that's something that probably needs to outside of me, because it's a specific planning issue. But if it does raise how a process issue in terms of governance, in terms of how that's being communicated, I think there's a pertinent question to be there. And I think there needs to be some reassurance that the right information is going to elected members so that they're aware of their rights, etc. Councillor Dowson and then Councillor Illingworth, and then I want to move on to the next agenda item because we are quite busy.
Yeah, just a quick one with regard to sort of the governance. Do you think the council have sufficient protocols in place with regard to cross-departmental working? I'm thinking specifically around highways, around forestry. There's lots of areas where to make a good planning decision, you need a good relationship. And you know, rumour has it that there's quite a lot of silo working, and getting that cooperation sometimes can't be easy. Am I right or wrong?
I would say, Councillor, that we have good working relationships with colleagues across the authority. I think one of the benefits of the pre-app process is to embed those technical services in planning at a very early stage. So, for example, colleagues in highways, environmental health and other services, and then the applicant can get a very joined up view as to where we stand as an authority with regard to particular applications. That isn't to say that some of the services that feed into planning haven't had their own pressures in terms of resources and capacity issues, but I know some adjustments have been made to try and strengthen those. And again, it's back to the protocols and the systems we have in place to make those areas of engagement effective. There's sort of the formal channels in terms of the pre-app processes and the formal consultation as part of applications, but I do encourage my officers to pick up the phone metaphorically and speak to colleagues, because it's very important that we get that joined up view in taking these applications forward. Thank you.
Councillor Illingworth.
Yes, Chair. I was going to ask if it's possible to have minimum standards for the maps that are used for planning decisions, if that's a remit for this committee, because I'm aware of planning disputes where the applicant had used the map in his deeds as the basis. It wasn't a particularly accurate hand-drawn map, about a century old, and not a particularly accurate map. And that was his planning application, which went through. I mean, it was accepted, but there is an issue sometimes about whether the drawings that people submit are a true reflection of what they intend to do. And disputes arise afterwards if the map quality isn't good enough. So I'm wondering if there's any standard enforcement that we can do to insist on OS maps and, you know, accurate information.
Just to slightly rephrase that into a corporate governance and audit question, is there a process in place to make sure that they're using the same map, and is that actually done on a universal basis rather than the situation John's highlighted?
Yeah, I don't know when that case dates from Councillor Illingworth, but we've recently updated our validation criteria. So we would filter out, so to speak, any plans, maps or any other supplementary information that wasn't appropriate, or if it was inadequate, we would deal with that at a validation stage.
Just as a quick supplementary to that, then, is that done manually or is there some form of automation in that process?
It's done manually at the moment, but the direction of travel in terms of the government's agenda around the digitization of planning services is to look at software that could automate the simpler applications, if that's going to be possible. And there are some pilot schemes which are underway up and down the country, and I think the findings of those are still awaited to see how effective they are. There are challenges, though, in terms of where information falls out of data that can't be easily automated, and given the nature of planning, we'd want to make sure that all of that was accurately captured.
And just one quick follow-up on that, in terms of from a governance perspective, are officers within the department trained to be looking at those documents in the same way, so that actually not getting very subjective decisions where one officer may say, well, that map's only 20 years old, so I'll use that, but that map's 50 years old in the case Councillor Illingworth raised, so I won't use that. How is consistency made there within the structure so that actually the same process is happening again and again and again?
I think, Chair, it comes back to revisiting the validation criteria. We've recently updated that. So there's a consistency required in order for us to be able to validate applications. So it's dealt with at that stage.
And is that peer review to make sure that they're all doing? Because so what I'm trying to get to is, it's very well to say you have a process and people are following it. How are you evaluating that they're following that process? Because obviously that's been, and then I think Councillor Illingworth has highlighted the case. It's that, is it being done consistently, and how are you checking it's being done consistently? Because obviously these can be some very substantial decisions for the authority and for the applicants in question.
Yeah, it is subject to regular review, and colleagues within the technical customer services team are always chasing service improvements where we can. We have a very open and regular dialogue with core cities, and we've actually had a recent visit from colleagues from Birmingham City Council who looked at our validation team, our validation work, as well as enforcement. So we do share best practice and learn from elsewhere, as well as others learning from Leeds as well.
Thank you very much for that. Are there any other questions before I move on to the next agenda item? Thank you very much for your time. I appreciate you're quite busy, so you're welcome to stay, but I appreciate you'll probably have other appointments to get to. So item agenda number, the recommendation. Getting a bit excited there, trying to get through. Does the committee agree the recommendation set out in the report to consider and note the positive assurance provided in this report and future steps to provide additional assurance to that process? I'll take silence as a yes. There we go. Thank you very much for that. Cheers. Item agenda number 9, external auditors annual report and value for money findings. Richard.
Thank you, Chair. This report presents Grant Thornton's annual auditors report for 2021. It also includes their assessment of value for money arrangements in the council. So not wanting to steal Grant Thornton's thunder, I think it's more appropriate I pass across to Grant Thornton. Thank you.
Thank you, Richard, and good morning, everybody. You have before you the auditor's annual report. This is a new report for 2020-21, and it replaces what we used to issue previously, which was the annual audit letter. It's a lot more detailed, the extent of VFM work that we undertake, and it follows the guidance under the National Audit Office Code of Audit Practice. 3 particular areas we look at: financial sustainability, governance, and improving economy efficiency and effectiveness. And for the first year, given the impact of COVID, we've also looked at the authorities' arrangements around dealing with the impact of COVID and managing that area. There are 3 types of recommendations that we can actually make. The lowest form is an improvement recommendation. And then it goes up to key recommendations and then statutory recommendations. Key recommendations in the middle is the one where there are significant weaknesses. And I'm pleased to report that we've identified no key recommendations or significant weaknesses from our work. Obviously, the authority is under a lot of financial pressures given the financial situation across the economy, but also impacting on most local authorities. And I think particularly so with the high level of inflation and the impact that's having on energy costs and pay costs to Leeds, but across all local government and the public sector too. One of the areas that we've particularly looked at is just benchmarking Leeds against other metropolitan authorities, just to see how you're performing in the pack. And that's identified a couple of areas, particularly around reserves, which is something that we've reported in previous years that we believe that perhaps they're not where they should be, and perhaps the authority considers increasing them, which we know the Chief Financial Officer for Financial Services is working on to increase going forward. And the other area that came out of the benchmarking work is the level of long-term borrowings as a percentage of your long-term assets, or indeed looking at as a percentage of your grants and other income with other authorities, which is another area that we've identified. We've made a number of recommendations which are included within the report, and we've received management recommendations to action those recommendations, and we will follow those up as part of our planned programme of work for next year. That's all I wanted to say, but happy to take questions.
Well, I'll open it up to members for questions. Well, I wasn't expecting. Oh, there go on, Councillor Dawson. There we go. Almost got away there.
It is from the appendix, and it's page 55, 6.1. I'm assuming that is something that, and it's with regard to things that are overdue, and children and families seem to come up as having a lot of reports that are overdue. What are the risks involved in not being prompt in providing reports? If things are overdue, how long before? Have I got the wrong report?
You're in the wrong report, Councillor Dawson. We're coming to that one. Save your question.
So those of you who do have to answer it, I'm going to be asking that question. Apologies.
Always good to have a bit of pre-warning.
Yeah.
Any other questions or comments on this particular report? Okay, well, there we go. Well, thank you very much for that. Now I need to do the recommendation bit. Yes, I always keep forgetting the recommendation bit because it's long and generally eager to get through it. Does the committee agree the recommendation is set out in the report to receive the annual audit report presented by Grant Thornton and to note the recommendations for improvement which have been made? I'll take silence as acceptance. There we go. Thank you very much for that. That's greatly appreciated. So item number 10, internal audit report. Jonathan, I believe this is yours.
Thank you, Chair. Bad timing. I'll wait for that to go. It is just a test. Okay, given the agenda size, would you like me to give a little tour through the report with it being a slightly different format, or would you like it to take it as read?
We'll take it as read and open it to the questions, which is obviously the important bit. So any questions or comments? Councillor Dowson.
You should say that. Yeah, it is. Reports are really important and they take a lot of time to actually write. So I appreciate this has taken an awful lot of work. And most parts of the council, actually, because of the sort of swinging cuts that we've had, are quite under-resourced. So this is by no means a criticism, but it is an honest question with regard to reporting, because you do have at 6.1 a list of high and medium priority recommendations. So somebody's taken the time to actually go through something and make a recommendation which you would expect to be acted on relatively promptly, otherwise it wouldn't have been raised. And you know, you've got some the columns here are quite good, not due yet and so on, but that there are some that are overdue, but it doesn't tell us how overdue. I mean, we're all guilty. I was at university writing my reports at the very last minute and sometimes missing the deadline. Are we talking about, and how important do you feel it is that these are done promptly, and what do you think as a consequence we could perhaps put in place as a corporate team to make sure that when reports are recommended, that they are actually done and received and responded to?
Thank you, and totally agree, to be honest, on the importance of these recommendations. Like I say, this is a hugely important process. I would add that this is the very first time that we've gone into the recommendation tracking process, and I think it's important to take that information in the context that we are still getting used to it. I think we are as a service, so are the departments that are responsible for filling in the trackers. And just because something isn't marked as complete, because the onus is on the service area to mark those as complete, they ultimately own the control environment and they are their recommendations to make. It doesn't necessarily mean that they haven't been implemented just because it hasn't been updated. It may be symptomatic of the fact that we are still working on this process to get it right in terms of getting it to the right people at the right time. Sometimes, for example, reports will have been issued very late in the period, which gives little chance. So we will be continuing to work on that. But I think, as you say, you can't understate the importance of it. This is the control environment of the council, and we are making high and medium priority recommendations for a reason here. And obviously, we do expect engagement with that. I think we allude to in the report that as we establish this further, we will be bringing in a sample checking process as well. And I think we can reassure you further that where these relate to something where we've given a limited opinion, then we also formally follow that up with another audit in that area to be able to double check what has happened there. So I think overall, like I say, you'll see in there very much that the results are a mixed picture. I don't want to get too much into individual recommendations relating to specific reports, but I think we do expect to see further engagement as we go along with this. But we see this as very valuable information for yourselves as members of the committee. And we also certainly know the importance of it and keep promoting that. So we'll continue to work on that with the services across the council. And
you're quite right, at this level, we don't need to know each each individual report. That'd be, but I suppose I love RAG ratings because it is an honest assessment by the person doing that report as to where you think you are. And you've already mentioned, you know, if you issue a report on Wednesday and the reporting period is Friday, you're not going to get a report, but that wouldn't be red RAG rated because that hasn't been ticking over. So it'd be quite interesting, I suppose, in the longer term, to actually break this down into ones that are seriously overdue and that are high and put the council at risk, as opposed to ones that really are just process.
To be honest, I think that's a really good suggestion, and we are looking at the ways that we present this information. So very much we'll take that on board, and I like that thought, yes. So we will look at that for the future.
Thanks, Jonathan. I think that's you've stole my question. So that's great. I do have a follow-on question to that though, Jonathan, if I may. So you've got the column there for high and medium priority recommendations, which again I think is great. You know, I asked this question a long time ago, and I'm really pleased to see this information. It does beg further questions, and we do have to be careful as an audit committee that we don't get sucked into the detail, because that's your area, and that's great. However, my question is, on the high priority ones, is there anything that we should be worried about as an audit committee? And if there is, then would you be bringing that to us? And linked to that, sorry, is once you've got this embedded, because I appreciate that it's new and you're working on getting the data up to date, but once you've got this embedded, do you have, or do you propose to have, an escalation process for when these the medium and highs do go so far overdue that you do become worried, and then we can be satisfied that that process is working properly? Thank you.
Can I take that one, Linda? So I think the first question was, should we be worried? The answer as today is no. The second question was, do we have a process where we escalate? We are forming that, because obviously we said it's we're currently trying to embed the process. So yes, we will be escalating internally and obviously to members. We will also, so what was the other bits of the question? There was lots of questions in the question.
Sorry, I think that was it, Louise, really. It was about giving us comfort that there's nothing that we need to be worried about. If there is, would you bring that to us?
Absolutely, because obviously my overriding aim is to get a sound control environment. And if I had concerns that this was being compromised in any way, if I'd exhausted all opportunities internally, obviously I would come to members and the chair. Thank you.
I was going to ask about access by members of the public to audit information and the audit process. I'm aware that there are some legislative things about what you can see, what you can't see, but I'd like you to say a bit more about what the public can do in participating in the audit process, whether they can take information away, how confidential the council's accounts are, and all the issues that arise in that sort of interface between public research and the council's desire to run an efficient operation at reasonable cost.
Yeah, I can take the external audit element of that, Chair, if I may, Councillor Inworth. So in terms of the public's role in the external audit process, in terms of inspecting the accounts, that is a formal process. It does exist. So the draft accounts are what's called put on deposit for public information, and members of the public within the Leeds borough, if they're on the electoral register, can raise an objection to the accounts and question the external auditor. They've got a 30 working day period to do that. That's now concluded. I think it was mid-September it finished, didn't it, Mary, off the top of my head? We didn't receive any formal queries this year, but nevertheless, these do arise from time to time. We would then consider whether they're a valid objection or not, and then potentially take that forward. But it's not, there have been no sort of formal objections received in terms of this year's audit.
I was thinking not so much in terms of objections, because I'm sure our accounts are pretty good actually, and it isn't the same, but the perfectly reasonable academic research on say, for example, health outcomes, and you want to know the local authority spending in particular areas of the city, that sort of thing is an entirely legitimate bit of politics. How would you do it?
I think Mary may have a view on this, but I think in the accounts or the covering sort of wording where the accounts are on the website, that there is the possibility of, you know, raising questions to officers on the accounts. You know, as I understand it, members of the public, you know, can ask for that information potentially through an FOI, but there is a more formal route to question the external auditor. That's the bit I was referring to, Councillor Inworth. But my understanding is that, you know, if members of the public wanted to ask a particular question, that you know, the council would be able to consider that.
Just supplementary, Chair. Let's try and phrase this correctly. If before a decision has been taken, the council's financial position is protected because obviously it interferes with the tendering process if the people who are tendering are aware of what your cash limit is. And so I understand that, and often see instances where the council has declined to publish the figures because it's a live decision and we haven't taken it yet, and so forth. Does that lapse? What happens with, say, 5 years down the line? Or is this something which is a permanent restriction on access?
Probably one more for officers, but I think
okay.
No, thank you. I once the contract's been let, and the contract's in place, then it is published. And then what we do is any transaction over £500, we publish that as well on the data mill. So it is very transparent on what's happening. The reason why we don't publish that information while negotiations are going on is because it's commercially sensitive and could impede the outcome of that contract negotiation if a supplier knew how much we'd got in set aside to fund that. Yeah, okay, thank you.
Councillor Dowson.
Yes, just a quick one with regard to your customer satisfaction questionnaire by assurance block. And you haven't got a column there for councillors. Bearing in mind we have sort of overview over a lot of these different departments that are reporting back to you anyway. I'm just wondering if there's any value in having the views of councillors with regard to the audit process and the spending on these different departments.
I think there is, yes. Traditionally, we've reported this on the work that we've carried out within each assurance block. So that is each area of audit activity. But I think very much, yes, there would be some merit in asking yourselves and councillors and members for feedback about our service as well. So another one that we can consider there.
I'm just trying to remember where I am. 2 seconds. Yeah, just remember what I was on there, sorry, because it jumped about a little bit there. Any other questions or comments for the officers? Yep.
Thank you. Just a quick one on page 70, Jonathan, on your internal audit productivity. There's a couple of items on there that look like you're a little bit behind where you expect to be. For example, ICT and information governance. This is on the bar graph, and financial systems. Do you have a plan to catch those up, or is it purposely a little bit behind?
I think they were expected at this stage to be a little bit behind. The plan is profiled over the course of the year, and sometimes we will have to put more resource into certain areas. So there are plans to catch up in those areas, and I would expect that by the time we come back to yourselves with the next update report next time, you will see a rebalancing in those areas specifically.
Thank you. It's really, again, page 70 is really reassuring to see that a lot of emphasis is basically paid on the anti-fraud and corruption with regards to time and effort and whatever, which is great. My question is with regards to the businesses COVID grant funding that we had, and we had quite a large amount in terms of people who committed fraud and whatever you say. In terms of recovery, where are we at with regards to that? Thank you.
Can I provide that information outside of the meeting, so I give the up-to-date position in terms of the recovery, please? Thank you.
Any other questions or comments before I go on to the recommendations? Okay. So does the committee agree that the recommendations set out in the report to A, receive the internal audit update report covering the period from June to August 2022, and note that work undertaken by internal audit during the period covered by the report? I'll take silence as a yes. Okay. B, note that there have been no limitations in scope and nothing has arisen to compromise the independence of the internal audit during the period of the report. Take silence again as a yes. And C, receive the report providing information relating to the monitoring of urgent decisions covering the period June to August 2022. Again, I'll take silence as a yes. Yep. So thank you very much for that. Moving on to item number 11, internal audit report and opinion. Louise.
Thanks, Chair. Again, would you like me to take this as being read and open it up for questions?
Yeah, due to the size of the report, just take it as read and we'll open up to questions. So any questions from members of the panel? Yep.
On page 90, could you perhaps give us a little more information on the table you've got there, particularly with regard to the tracking of these issues?
Thank you, Councillor. Again, it's part of the embedding of the new process. I think we covered that quite extensively in the update report. Is there any particular questions around any of the areas you'd like to ask?
Really, you're depending on the trackers to actually provide the information rather than actually digging it out yourself. My apologies if that sounds a bit blunt, but you're relying on people to give you the information you're actually checking on.
In the first instance, yes, but as Jonathan highlighted earlier, we are undertaking sample checking on a risk basis. So going forward, we will also be able to start reporting to the committee the outcomes of that sample checking, of the self-disclosures from each directorate.
Yeah, on the subject of sample checking, and probably a completely different tack, and who knows, I might be corrected and it might not be for this meeting, but it's with regard to procurement. I know we always have issues with regard to procurement, because 9 times out of 10, either your local councillor who's asked for something to be done, or a local resident or a local business will say, how much? Because they could have done it cheaper or got it cheaper. We had a kitchen refurbishment at one of our centres that was initially quoted at 3 times what a national kitchen fitter quoted. And I'm just wondering how many checks and balances we have in place with our recognised providers to make sure that there is a level of transparency, so people can be assured that they're actually getting best value, which doesn't mean cheapest, but it means what it says, the best value.
First of all, on that one, I think it's important to understand how the council is set up from a procurement perspective. So in the first instance, the onus is very much on the contract management function. So every contract across the council will have a contract manager or contract managers. And a big part of that role, obviously, is around checking the information that comes through regularly on that contract and being able to stringently check those invoices that come through, and be able to give assurance through that we are not being charged more than we should be through the contract. Because you are right, this is, of course, a big risk that all public sector organisations will face. We also have a central procurement function, and I know the head of procurement was obviously here at the last committee to give an update on the role that they play in there. But we also, as an internal audit function, devote a substantial portion of our plan towards procurement activity. So within that, we will look at particular areas. So we do particular contract management coverage, for example. So we will look in detail at a particular contract arrangement. And again, that's to make sure that in the way that that has been procured, it's gone through the right process that it's expected to, but very much in the management of that contract, that there are processes in place that are working to make sure that people are providing that challenge each time an invoice comes in. So we will look in detail at particular contracts or risk areas. I would say on that note always that if there are particular areas that you have concerns about, we would welcome those so that we can consider that within our contract management coverage. But as I say, a substantial focus of our plan is in that area because we do recognise the risk of it, and they are that kind of the layers of assurance that you can take that there are checks to challenge those particular types of instances.
Yeah, 2 points, and again, possibly not in your area, and we'd need to get the other person back around procurement, and that is the issuing of contracts in the first place, and checks and balances around making sure that we're actually getting a good quote and a good price, because it is all public money, and it's our job to make sure that we're actually getting that good price in the first place. And the second is managing what they call value engineering. So somebody getting a contract saying they can do X, Y, and Z, and gradually, bit by bit, because the cost of steel's gone up, or this has gone up, or that, which are justifiable, and you can actually quantify those if they're different to the assessment that they gave in the first place. But often it isn't. So there is a level of value engineering that goes on, and I'm wondering at what point we actually look at that value engineering, or is it through the managers that you've mentioned previously? I seem to remember there was one school contract where we ended up paying.
Sorry, Councillor Dalton, I apologize. We went through this in quite a lot of detail at the last committee, so I think maybe we get a briefing note out to members to go over that one.
That was actually my final point,
yeah.
Chair, so you've extended me a little bit.
So there we go. I will just one very, very quick question. We've talked about external. What about internal contracting? So we have departments that contract to departments and internal inflation within the system for departments trying to cover each other's budgets. I'm not going to ask for a full detailed question now and response now, but we can also have a briefing note on actual internal procurement within itself and how we're preventing internal inflation within the system.
Happy to come back with that information. And just to assure you there, within our contracts procedure rules, the first step of any decision to get something is to go to the internal service provider first to try and keep that money within the council. So we will come back with more information to you, but that is very much the first step in any decision there.
Thank you. Any other questions or comments on this particular report? Okay, so going on to the recommendation then. Does the committee agree the recommendation set out in the report to receive the internal audit report and opinion for 2021-2022 and note that the opinion given in particular on A, that based on the audit work undertaken for the 2021-2022 internal audit plan, the internal control environment, including the key financial systems, risks and governance is well established and operating effectively in practice? I'll take silence as a... Go on.
Sorry, isn't that the report you've just asked for?
Is it the one? Yes. Have I jumped one here? Yeah, I've gone on to number. Have I got? No, I'm on number 11. No, yeah, I'm on number 11. Yeah, they are very similar. Yeah, I was reading it myself. No, they're just very wordly similar. So no, I'm on the right one. So do you want me to read A again? No. Shall we take silence as a yes? There we go. B, a satisfactory overall opinion is provided for 2021-2022 based on the audit work detailed within the report. I'll take silence as a yes. Fantastic. And C, okay, this is a long one. That the work undertaken to support the opinion has been conducted in accordance with an established methodology that promotes quality and conformance with the international standards for the professional practice of internal audit, IPPF, and the committee is also asked to note that there have been no limitations in scope and nothing has arisen to compromise the independence of the internal audit during the report. If I ever have to say that again, it will be too soon. I'll take silence. I'll take silence as a yes. There we go. I'm glad I don't have to read that one to you. Item number 12, Kate.
This is the annual governance statement, which has been brought or is being brought back to committee following the period on public deposit. There were no questions or comments raised by the public. It has been updated with the annual audit opinion from internal audit and the value for money opinion coming from external audit that you've received and agreed today. So it's asking the committee to approve the final annual governance statement, which will then be published with the accounts in due course.
Thank you. So just bearing in mind, we've gone over those additional bits already in this committee. Are there any other questions or comments on that before we go to the recommendation? No, fantastic. So to the recommendation, does the committee agree the recommendation set out in the report to approve the 2022 annual governance statement, including the action plan for 2022? I'll take silence as a yes. There we go. Fantastic. Item number 13, a grandfathering audit plan 2021-2022.
Thank you, Chair. I'll take this and just keep the introduction relatively brief. I'll just draw out one or two key messages on page 180 of your pack, section 2, headed up Introduction and Headlines. So this audit plan is looking at the key areas of focus for our audit work for the 21-22 accounts audit. So as you've already heard from Mary, we're nearly there in terms of the completion of the 2021 annual accounts. There is the national issue around accounting for infrastructure, so your roads and bridges, where there's a national issue that's trying to get to a point of resolution, hopefully before the end of this year. In addition to that point, there's a couple of valuation areas around your pension fund and assets that we're currently working through with finance colleagues. But essentially, the 2021 audit is virtually complete. This plan is now looking at the 21-22 external audit process. So our significant risks in terms of the accounts audit, in common with previous years, are around the key areas of your balance sheet that are subject to significant judgments and assumptions, and they are the big values in your balance sheet. So the valuation of your land and buildings, your council dwellings, and your share of the West Yorkshire Pension Fund. And then in addition to that, the usual standard significant risk of management override of control. So where are those areas of the accounts where management potentially could manipulate the financial position? And that's a significant risk across all audits in all sectors. It's not unique to Leeds City Council. Our materiality calculation based on the draft 21-22 accounts is broadly in line with the prior year at just less than 27 million. So we don't audit to the penny. We audit to a level of materiality to make sure that the accounts are clear from material misstatement. The value for money arrangements review, clearly that will be taking place again. So Perminda's just taking you through the prior year report. So for 21-22, we're hoping to report that to this committee in February. And again, there'll be a review around your financial position, your governance, and your performance management arrangements. Just over the page in terms of the logistics on page 181. So the planning for the 21-22 is being performed in the summer. We're expecting that audit to commence this month and work through into the new year. And providing we can get that old year audit concluded, we're hoping to conclude the current year 21-22 audit by the end of February. And our ISA 260 report that we produce on the accounts for 21-22 again is planned to come to this committee in February. The audit fee is subject to PSAA approval. That's the regulatory body that oversees the local government audit contracts, and essentially the fee is in line with the prior year. So that's all I was proposing to say, Chair, but obviously happy to take any questions. Thank you.
Any questions or comments? Or yeah, Councillor Illingworth.
How you deal with multi-year contracts and falling behind schedule? It often happens with big contracts. You almost expect them to be behind schedule. And obviously, last-minute decisions, which year the things are going to be counted in. Is there a sort of procedure for, I'm sure there is a procedure for dealing, what is the procedure for dealing with this so that you get continuity and assurance, I guess the word I'm looking for, over the year end?
Do you mean in terms of the delivery of the audit contract by Grant Thornton to the council, or do you mean contracts that the council has with other organisations? So yeah, so that's good question. So there will be contracts that are multi-year. And obviously, the finance team, I'm sure, may wish to comment. They will go through the accounting requirements for that in line with the appropriate accounting standards in terms of what should be recognised in year one, what's a future year recognition, and differences in terms of, how income elements are recognised as opposed to the expenditure side of things. There's different sort of thresholds and in terms of the recognition criteria. So in essence, a lot of accounting standards in recent years, Councillor Erlingworth, have looked to recognise the costs early so that they're not delaying bad news, if you like, to put it in simple terms. So the finance team will go through that. They'll review the accounting against the accounting standards, the sit for code of practice for accounting in local government, and any sort of key material ones. They will form part of our regular dialogue with Victoria and Richard and Mary that Parminder and I and our team have to make sure that the judgments that the finance team are reaching on those key contracts look reasonable and materially appropriate to us. And then obviously we'll come along subsequent to that to audit them in some detail. So there is a process in place that obviously commences with finance colleagues looking at these contracts and then engaging with us, and then us coming along to do the detailed audit thereafter.
Okay, is there a follow-up?
No, I was going to say thank you. It's a really clear reply, and I can see the problem that faces you. It's a big one.
As you know, Councillor, if you were on the training session that we did a couple of weeks ago, I mean, not just around contracts per se, but it's quite a challenging environment in terms of auditing of local authority accounts, as a number of you are well aware of. Thank you.
Councillor Dowson.
Yes, you're always drawn when you look at reports to something that says significant risks identified, and you sort of put your sort of scouting hat on and see what these are and what you've put in place to make sure those risks are mitigated. So that's quite an interesting one, and thank you for that. I wanted just to ask a question about valuation of land and buildings, including council dwellings, because you've got a level, it's every 5 years, it says here, that they're actually assessed. I'm assuming that's on a rolling programme, but what recommendations could come out of that? Because whilst land appreciates in value normally, there is an element of depreciation as well occasionally, especially with buildings if they're not maintained properly and so on and so forth. So at what point, or is it part of this process that where a depreciation because of lack of maintenance comes to light, and that is highlighted to whoever that needs to be highlighted to get that resolved?
Thank you very much, Councillor Dowson, for that question. The valuation of land and buildings is such a huge area of our external audit work. There's an awful lot of work that goes on by the council staff. The council employs its own specialist valuers, both internal to the council and in some cases external, and they will give their expert view around making sure that the different elements of land, buildings, council dwellings are appropriately valued at each 31st of March year end. It's an increasing area of focus for external audit over recent years, and particularly for our regulators who review our work. So again, those of you will know that Parminder and I have had a recent FRC inspection of our audit of Leeds in 1920. And they spent an awful lot of time looking at the work that we did around the valuation of your land and buildings. So there is a process in place. There are certain challenges within that because certain different types of land and different types of buildings are valued in a slightly different way. And they are subject to a lot of assumptions, and any changes in those assumptions that could be relatively small changes in assumptions. When you spread that out across the asset base on an authority the size of Leeds, that could very quickly become a material change. And obviously, as soon as there's a material change, as auditors, we need to make sure we're comfortable with that. Otherwise, I couldn't issue a clean opinion on your accounts. So in terms of, the focus and potential risk that could go wrong, we could identify assets that we think that on our review, don't appear to be valued appropriately. And that will lead to further challenge and questioning of the finance team, of the valuer. And that process, is quite a key element of our overall audit work. We probably spend, I'd say, around 1/3 to 40% of our external audit time looking at the valuation of your land and buildings and your share of the West Yorkshire Pension Fund as a pension fund liability, because there's such huge numbers on your balance sheet. And as I say, they are subject to such fluctuations and assumptions. What I would say is that any movements in the valuation of your land and buildings, appreciation or even reduction in value, they don't ultimately trickle down into the usable reserves of the council. There's a complex, there's a methodology of accounting in local government that reverses out the impairment of those assets. The writing down of those assets are effectively reversed out before it impacts on council tax levels and your usable reserves that Victoria can use for the overall running of the authority. But because they are such high value areas, and because our regulator is really challenging external audit firms to do a lot of testing on those areas, they do remain a key area of our work. So Paminda and I find it very interesting and fascinating area, because it is, and it does involve a lot of other areas within the council in terms of finance, estates, specialist valuers, to make sure we get to a position where those values are accurate at the 31st of March.
And would the valuation of our assets affect the interest rates we pay on borrowing?
It's potentially one bit more for officers, that, because obviously the council does take out borrowing principally through Public Works Loan Board, and typically that's at a fixed rate for a large period of time. But we've included in our value for money report earlier, we did an assessment around the sort of council's level of borrowing against its its gross assets and against its levels of income. So I'm not sure hand on heart whether it does affect the level of interest rate that's charged on those PWLBs to Leeds directly, but it is a factor as part of the overall, I guess, medium-term financial position of the council, to make sure that any borrowings that the council's taking out is affordable and fundable on the envelope that you've got.
Thank you. Yes, I can confirm that it doesn't affect the interest rates that we pay, but we are very mindful on the level of borrowing that we have. Yeah. And it's around being able to service that debt. And therefore, that's why in the capital strategy, we've taken the decision that we would only increase borrowing to the amount that we repay MRP, which is the minimum revenue position, unless it's for things like our investor save. So we're investing in an asset to deliver a saving for the council. And those are the only circumstances now that we would increase our level of borrowing above that we're repaying on the MRP. Okay, thank you.
Councillor Illingworth first, and then
yes, can I ask you about viability? A common stratagem nowadays for planning applicants is to declare, after the decision has been taken, that a particular part of the scheme is non-viable and therefore has to be excused contributions to, say, green space or public amenities that were formerly part of the planning decision. You don't know that for possibly 5 years down the line. It depends what he's actually sold his houses for and whether he's actually made the profit that he'd penciled in. But it's really massively in the public interest to be assured that people aren't fiddling the accounts and claiming for non-viability when the scheme is perfectly viable and very profitable. How do you audit that? Because it's years later.
Councillor, if I don't think it's for them to audit, they're auditing our accounts. That's for someone else to audit their own accounts. I think that's a question for David Feeney offline, as it were. But that's not for that's not for our auditors, because we're not saying that. Question Midgley.
Thank you, Chair. It's just going back to the valuation of buildings. Are reserves based on the reinstatement value of the properties rather than the market value? Because particularly now when inflation's soaring, cost of materials is increasing, there could potentially be quite a big gap, couldn't there?
That's a really good question, Councillor Midgley. So different elements of your land and buildings will be valued on a different basis. So a lot of your specialist assets where there isn't an open market value, so like your schools, for example, they're valued on what's known as depreciated replacement cost basis. Whereas, you know, some of your assets that may be deemed surplus or held for sale, they might be in a more sort of fair value, market value approach. And that's the type of discussions that we get into with finance and with your values to make sure that the different types of valuation methodology are appropriate for the particular asset in question. So really good question. And that is one of the key things that we do sort of check and challenge management on to make sure that that valuation approach is appropriate for any particular asset.
Any other questions or comments on this report? Yep.
Thank you. So my question's going straight into the Appendix C, where you're looking at progress against prior year recommendations. There's about eight or nine recommendations in there, maybe more. A couple of them look like they relate to your IT general controls testing. And my question is, do you follow those up sooner than because it says what it says is we will consider the revised arrangements in place once we commence the 21-22 final accounts audit. I know that you've said that, you know, audit resources can be scarce or tight at particular times of year, but given probably the importance of these actions, would you propose to follow these up earlier?
So I'll bring Perminder in a moment, because I think our IT colleagues are currently planning their 21-22 work, and they will absolutely be following up their well, started today, so as Perminder's just said. So our IT colleagues will be reviewing the 21-22 work that they need to deliver, and in addition, Linda, they will be following up their recommendations from the prior year, absolutely. And I think just overall, in terms of the recommendations at Appendix C, clearly there will be a full disclosure of our views in terms of whether they've been implemented or otherwise in the ICE 260 report, which will come to this committee in February.
Yeah, thank you. I guess my worry, I guess if I have a worry, it's if those actions aren't implemented, what are the implications, and is there an opportunity for you guys to come in a little bit sooner? Maybe when you do your interim audit, or ask for the council to provide an update earlier than waiting for the following year, if that makes sense.
Yeah, so what we aim to do is our IT people will look at the weaknesses that we've identified in the recommendations, and they would look at that quite early on. If there are any issues where action hasn't been taken, then that's elevated to the audit team. And that would then feed into our risk assessment at the authority in terms of, do we need to do any additional work or focus on particular areas of work? And that's done quite early on. So it wouldn't wait until we actually kick off the rest of the audit work. And if appropriate, then we would feed back any concerns, first of all, to management, just to see if they can take action to make things happen. And if that's not forthcoming, then we would report that in one of the update reports as a sort of an interim measure.
Any other questions or comments, Councillor Almas?
Thank you, Chair. Appendix B, with regards to the digital audit experience. I mean, obviously, the City Council adopted it a couple of years before. You know, you're putting it into practice in terms of relying on this system. I mean, have you had any sort of feedback from people who've already used it, and would it be useful in terms of the actual efficiency, or is it purely because of just on technical basis? So I'm just trying to figure the pros and cons of. I mean, it's good to have these new programs and what have you, but in terms of actual reliability and what have you, and efficiency, would it impact?
That's Good question. So the inflow technology is something that Grant Thornton introduced a couple of years ago, and it's in place at the vast majority of our public sector audit clients, both local authorities and NHS, and it helps a number of areas of it. One is in terms of, you know, a clear level of line of communication in terms of things that we've requested and the client responds to, and there's a clear date stamp of to when things have been asked for, when things have been sent back. And also it helps a lot of the interrogation of information from general ledgers to help drive audit samples and audit testing that should lead to you know, a more efficient audit process. One of the challenges at Leeds is obviously your ledger system is an in-house one that's quite old now. So some of the aspects of the inflow technology are quite difficult to integrate into that ledger system. Obviously, you know that will change in the future. But in overall terms, in terms of our audit approach nationally, it has been a successful tool for auditors and indeed for clients, to be fair. I don't know if there's anything you wanted to add to that, Parminder.
I think the additional benefit is once it's working, it will allow time to be saved at authorities. So for officers, the amount of time that they need to extract information, it will be done automatically. So the great benefit elsewhere is saving in time. At the moment, obviously, that doesn't apply at Leeds, given sort of the FMS system is quite dated. But once the new system comes in, we're hopeful that will provide benefits to both sides.
Any other questions or comments? Councillor Dawson?
Just some clarity, really. And this is probably me, not you. So you're explaining something. I have a business degree, you know, and finance was part of it, but it wasn't the main part. And I skipped through it. So a lot of this is quite interesting. Where you've got the Appendix C, as you referred to, and there's lots of TBCs at the front of it as the assessment, but the actions at this side, update on actions, is what the council are going to do. But you haven't said on this report that they've done it. You've said that you're going to report it in the audit findings report. Wouldn't it be easier for mere mortals just to say whether it's been done or not? And that's just on reporting, really, just to make it easier for us rather than have to find whether it's been done or not in a report.
Yeah, so what we try and do here is just set out the recommendations that we made last year and the management responses. The normal audit process is to be followed up the following cycle. So as the cycle hasn't yet started, we can't really say whether you've done it or you haven't done it yet. Hence the comments there. The TBC really, normally, once we complete the work, it would either have a tick on it or a cross. So when it comes in the audit findings report, you will have that completed at that time.
Sorry, Chair, it's just that sometimes you forget there's such a significant lag in reporting. So when it says 21-22, it is actually not 21-22. When you get that report, it is actually a lot later, isn't it? Sorry, thank you.
Any other questions or comments before I move on to the recommendation? Okay, so does the committee agree that the recommendation set out in the report to receive the annual audit plan presented by Grant Thornton and to note and agree the nature and scope of the proposed audit work? I'll take silence as a yes. There we go. Item number, well, it says 15 on my list, but it's actually number 14. Audit risk assessment inquiries 2021-2022.
Thank you, Chair. So this report presents a series of risk-related inquiries that Grant Thornton have asked to be considered by the committee as part of their 21-22 audit process. This is the second year that they've taken this approach, and the content of the questions is very similar to last year for the benefit of those members who were on the committee last year. So in the appendix to the report, the columns that have yellow headings, those are the proposed responses by officers to the questions that have been posed. And the committee are asked to consider those proposed responses and confirm whether or not they are in accordance with the committee's understanding. So I appreciate it's a very long and in some cases technically complicated document. It was circulated to members of the committee earlier than the main papers to allow additional time to consider that. And myself and the other officers present will be happy to try and answer any questions relating to the proposed responses. And I think if there are any questions around the purpose behind the inquiries, I'm sure Grant Thornton team will be happy to address those. Thank you.
Any questions or comments? Okay, no questions or comments, so we'll go on to the recommendation then. Does the committee agree the recommendation set out in the report to consider the response proposed by officers to Grant Thornton's inquiries and to confirm whether these are consistent with members' understanding of the council's arrangements in these areas? Again, I'll take silence as acceptance. Okay. Item number 15, work programme.
There are no proposed changes to the work programme from the last meeting.
Any questions from members? Well, that went a bit quicker than I thought. So thank you for attending today's committee, and that's the end of the meeting. So thank you very much, everyone.